So the first question, Russia could attack NATO as early as next year using the territory of Belarus. This shocking training scenario is described by the German publication in Bild based on a secret Bundeswehr document. That is, the German army is preparing for this, at least as one of scenarios. How realistic is that within the next year to a year and a half that Moscow could begin some type of aggressive action against the Baltic states and Poland?
So, of course, I think it's extremely unlikely, mainly because Russia, I don't believe, will have the capability to do that anytime soon. And I certainly would hope that Belarus would not allow itself to become involved in something like that, which would be a disaster for the people of Belarus. But I think people should not overreact to this thing. This is actually quite normal that all militaries are doing their duty when they think about possible scenarios and then think about contingencies to prevent or deal with these scenarios. You use this for exercises, for wargaming, for development of capabilities. And I think this is, for whatever reason this came out or how it got out is immaterial, is not relevant. What matters is that the Bundeswehr, I think, is doing a good job of thinking seriously about possibilities. And then, of course, taking the steps necessary to prevent or deter such a possibility from happening. My guess is that if the U.S. and other Western countries fail to help Ukraine, and if we look disunited and unprepared, then the risk of Russia making a terrible decision again goes up. But if NATO looks strong and prepared and cohesive, and especially if we continue to help Ukraine, then I think it's much less likely.
In this scenario, they are speaking about the new huge wave of Russian mobilization. If Russia does not start a new wave of large mobilization in next months, then it will be not able to implement this scenario, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I'm very skeptical of any reports of a huge wave of mobilization. I don't think you could find 10 Russians that actually want to be in Ukraine, for example. And I think that the Kremlin is avoiding having to do another mobilization, especially before their fake election here on March the 17th. But also, I think they know that there are a lot of unhappy people inside the Russian Federation. And most of their recruiting has been done out in the poorer parts of Russia, not so much around Moscow and St. Petersburg. So if they had to recruit heavily from those two metropolitan regions, you'd be seeing a lot more funerals of Russian soldiers taking place there, and that would make it even more difficult for the Kremlin to keep up this facade. Sergei, I actually think Russia is soon going to be a failed state. They have terrible demographics, failing economy. The military has been severely damaged. Their defense industry is weak. I mean, they're having to import ammunition from North Korea and drones from Iran. I think that the idea that they could raise a huge army and train them and properly equip them and do something that would be effective against NATO countries is very difficult for me to imagine. But the Bundeswehr and others are doing the correct thing to prepare for the possibility. You can't say they'll never do that. I mean, that's why we're in the problem we're in now, is because we said after the Cold War, we'll never have to fight the Russians. We don't need all this stuff. And of course, we were wrong.
According to this scenario, in the spring, the Kremlin will launch a large-scale offensive in Ukraine, and due to inefficient Western support to Kiev, Russia will defeat the Ukrainian army by the June of 24. Is it real? What do you think about it?
Again, this is a scenario. It's not based on fact. It's a scenario that was created to give staffs and analysts a vehicle to think through what if contingencies, requirements, and so on. Today, Russia does not have, in my view, does not have the ability to knock out Ukraine. I mean, they are losing 1,000 people every day in these meat wave attacks against Ukrainian defenders around Avdiivka, for example. I don't see any new capability appearing out of nowhere or units that are properly trained that would be able to do that. You know, the best Russian units, the VDV, they have been bled so badly. They're on their, I think, the third reconstitution. So the core of what used to make the VDV the best Russian soldiers is long gone. And it goes downhill from there. So the idea that all of a sudden they could break through in a significant way, to me, that just seems very difficult to fathom. And I think this is probably something that the general staff and the leadership of the army, of the military in Belarus understands, that they do not want to handcuff themselves to a losing side.
And this scenario of Russia's potential or hypothetical war against NATO, they are talking again about the breakthrough, the Suwalki corridor, in two strikes from the territory of Kaliningrad and Belarus. NATO has been preparing for such a scenario for a long time, for many, many years. How do you assess the possibility of using the territory of Belarus and resources of Lukashenko regime and Belarusian army in such a potential scenario?
Yeah, well, first of all, there would be zero positive outcome for Belarus if this happens. I mean, there's no possible good outcome for Belarus if they allow Russia to use Belarus as the starting point to drag Belarus into this, what would be a terrible conflict, number one. Number two, if Russia has made the decision to attack NATO, that means they have already made the decision to launch hundreds of missiles against civilian targets in NATO countries, just the way they're doing against Ukraine, against airports, seaports, power infrastructure, etc. So you can be sure then that there will be counterstrikes coming back. And Belarus, of course, would obviously, if there are Russians inside Belarus, Russian troops, and Russian missiles are being launched from inside Belarus, then against NATO countries, then there will be counterstrikes. So I see no good outcome for Belarus if they were to allow Russia to do anything like that.
Do you think it is still possible for Alexander Lukashenko to avoid this kind of confrontation? I mean, to let Russians use the Belarusian territory as they made in 22 against Ukraine. Do you think he's able to avoid direct participation in this kind of still potential scenario? But we have to speak about this kind of solutions.
Of course, I don't know, but he's managed so far to avoid significant participation. Again, I think my guess is that they don't see any real value in helping Russia. So it would be only to avoid being annexed by Russia would be my guess. I'm a little bit out of my expertise here, but just trying to think strategically. Who would Belarus benefit in any way from Russia coming in using Belarus as a launching pad for an attack against NATO. I don't see any benefit.
Yeah, for sure, there are no benefits, but probably he have no any choice. If
Well,
Putin will decide,
he always has a choice. I mean, you always have a choice. And I think we know from history that the Kremlin only respects strength. And so if they see weakness or wavering, then I think they will do what they want. But I'm not convinced.
So the last question, does such a scenario make any sense after Finland joined the alliance, the Euro, and in fact Sweden as well? So the Baltic Sea is now the kind of NATO internal sea. So the Russian enclave in Kaliningrad and Russian fleet is surrounded by the NATO forces.
Yeah, I mean, this is all thanks to the terrible strategic mistakes made by the Kremlin. They had a false reason for going to Ukraine to begin with. They told their own people this was about NATO expansion and all that. And as a result of their failed invasion of Ukraine, NATO has actually grown. And yet he has taken his soldiers away from the border with Finland and Estonia because he needs them in Ukraine, which it tells everybody that obviously he knows that NATO was never going to attack Russia. So I think at some point, people inside Russia will have to acknowledge the lies that have been the foundation for Putin's failed operations against Ukraine.
Sir, thanks a lot for the interview. It was a great pleasure to talk to you and present your thoughts to our audience.
Thank you, Sergey, and thank you for the opportunity. And I hope that I'll get to see you soon.